Two soldiers in World War II uniforms walk up to a 32-ton Sherman tank. They bend down, grab it by the treads, and lift it over their heads like it weighs nothing. Because it does. It's made of rubber. Trojan Horse versus D-Day's Operation Fortitude. Which military deception reveals the brutal truth about warfare? Welcome to Historical Versus, the channel that puts history on trial. One is the most famous trick in human storytelling, a wooden horse that ended a 10-year war. The other is a classified operation so absurd that when it was finally revealed, historians thought someone was joking. One exists in poetry written 1,000 years after it supposedly happened. The other exists in declassified files showing how the Allies convinced Hitler to defend against an army made of hot air, literally. Here's what you walked in expecting, a simple comparison of two clever military tricks. Here's what you're actually getting, the disturbing realization that the Trojan Horse story you know was written by a Roman poet doing propaganda for Augustus Caesar, while Operation Fortitude involved a Spanish chicken farmer inventing 27 fake people and getting a Nazi medal for it. We'll judge these deceptions on 5 brutal criteria that separate legend from reality. First, the setup. Then each deception exposed. Finally, the scoreboard delivers the brutal truth. You walk through the ruins of Troy today. Yes, it's real. Archaeologists found it in Turkey. And you can see the massive walls, the charred destruction layer from around 1180 BCE, the bronze arrowheads still embedded in stone. You can practically smell the smoke from a city that burned 3,000 years ago. What you won't find: any evidence of a giant wooden horse, not a splinter, not a wheel track, not even a passing mention in any Bronze Age text. The Iliad, Homer's great epic about the Trojan War, it doesn't mention the horse at all. The story you know comes from Virgil's Aeneid, Roman propaganda written over a millennium later. Meanwhile, in 1944, the Allies are attempting something that shouldn't work. They need to invade France, but the Germans know they're coming. The obvious landing site is Calais. It's the shortest crossing, has the best ports, offers the most direct route to Berlin. The Germans have their strongest army there, the 15th Army, nearly 200,000 men. So the Allies decide to land at Normandy instead. One problem: if those German divisions race south from Calais when the invasion starts, D-Day fails, the war drags on, millions more die. The solution? Convince the Germans that the Normandy invasion, the largest amphibious assault in human history, is actually just a diversion. The real invasion at Calais is still coming, with inflatable tanks. This sounds impossible. It nearly was. But here's the thing about the Germans in 1944. Their command structure was a paranoid mess of competing egos, with Hitler micromanaging from his mountain retreat, while his generals quietly despised each other. The German intelligence network in Britain had been completely compromised. Every single German spy had been captured and turned. The Allies didn't just have a window into the enemy's mind, they had administrator access to their entire intelligence system. The greatest deception in military history might not be the one you think. And the runner-up? Well, it might not have even happened.
You're crammed inside a wooden horse with 30 Greek warriors. Maybe 50. Actually, wait. One source says 23, another says 3,000, which would make this less of a horse and more of a wooden apartment complex. The smell is overwhelming. Pine pitch, sweat, and whatever Odysseus had for lunch. Someone's elbow is in your ribs. The bronze armor of the man behind you is pressing into your spine. Outside, you hear Trojan voices getting closer, then the deep groaning of wood as the entire structure lurches forward. They're pulling you into the city. Here's what you need to understand about this moment. It never happened. You want to know what archaeologists actually found at Troy? A city that was violently destroyed around 1180 BCE. Charred timber, embedded arrowheads, bronze ones, some in the Greek style, and human skeletons left unburied in the streets. One teenage girl, her teeth burned in the city's final fire. The city of Troy 7A, as archaeologists call it, absolutely fell to violence. Evidence of war? Everywhere. Evidence of a giant wooden horse? Bronze arrowheads. No horse. Not a splinter. Not a wheel track. Not a single contemporary text mentioning it. The Hittite records, which mention Troy, they called it Wilusa, talk about conflicts with the Greeks. But magical wooden horses? Silence. But here's where it gets worse. The story you know doesn't appear in Homer's Iliad, the actual epic about the Trojan War. That poem ends with Hector's funeral, long before any wooden livestock enter the picture. The first mention comes in Homer's Odyssey, but only as a throwaway line, like, "Remember that time with the horse?" The full dramatic version, the one with the priest Laocoon shouting warnings, the sea serpents, the breaking down of Troy's own walls to fit the horse through, that's from Virgil's Aeneid, written by a Roman, for Romans, over 1,000 years after Troy supposedly fell. Roman fan fiction. Think about that timing. Virgil is writing during the reign of Augustus Caesar, trying to give Rome a founding myth that connects them to the noble Trojans. He needs to explain how the Trojans, Rome's supposed ancestors, lost to the Greeks. The answer is, they didn't lose fairly. They were betrayed by Greek treachery and their own piety. It's the ancient equivalent of, "We didn't lose, we were stabbed in the back." Propaganda disguised as poetry. The scholarly consensus is the horse is probably a poetic metaphor, maybe for a siege engine. Battering rams were sometimes covered in wet horse hides for fire protection. Maybe for an earthquake. Poseidon was both the god of horses and earthquakes, and Troy 6 was destroyed by one. Or maybe it's just what it looks like, a story too good to fact-check. Want more evidence this is fiction? The numbers don't add up. 23 warriors? 3,000? The sources can't even agree on basic logistics. And then there's the Helen problem. She supposedly walks around the horse, perfectly imitating the voices of the Greek warriors' wives, trying to trick them into answering. This detail appears in the Odyssey, and it's genuinely disturbing. But it also makes no sense. Helen is trying to expose the Greeks, the same Greeks she supposedly wants to return to. The story can't even keep its own motivations straight. But let's steelman the Trojan horse. Let's say it happened exactly as Virgil describes. This is still a deception that relies on the Trojans being absolute idiots. After 10 years of siege warfare, they see the Greeks sail away, leaving behind a giant wooden structure, and their response is to immediately throw a party and bring it inside. The priest Laocoon literally tells them it's a trap. He throws a spear at it. So the Trojans' response? Well, when sea serpents conveniently appear and eat him, they decide this must mean the gods want them to accept the horse. The Trojan horse isn't history's greatest deception. It's history's greatest game of telephone, where a city's real destruction became a metaphor, became a story, became the myth everyone believes. But the Trojan horse relied on tricking an enemy after a 10-year siege. How do you deceive an enemy that's actively expecting you, using the most advanced intelligence in the world? The Allies were about to attempt something that makes fiction look amateur.
You're standing in a field in Kent, southeast England, Spring 1944. Before you stretches an entire armored division. Rows of 32-ton Sherman tanks, half-tracks artillery pieces, a massive military force preparing to crush Nazi Germany. You walk up to one of the tanks, place your hand on its side and push. It flies away like a balloon. Because that's exactly what it is. Welcome to Operation Fortitude, where the Allies fought World War II's most important battle with rubber, hot air, and a Spanish chicken farmer who hated fascism so much that he created an entire imaginary spy network just to destroy them. Here's the insane part. It worked. Think that's insane? Wait till you hear about the chicken farmer. Juan Pujol Garcia, codename Garbo. This is a man who hated fascism so much that when both the British and Americans rejected his offer to spy for them, he decided to become a double agent anyway. Operating from Lisbon with a tourist guide to Britain, a map, and railway timetables, he convinced the Germans he was running a network of agents across England. The British eventually realized someone was feeding the Germans hilariously wrong information. Garbo once reported that Glasgow men would do anything for a litre of wine, apparently unaware that Scots prefer whiskey, and recruited him. By D-Day, Garbo controlled 27 imaginary subagents. He'd killed one off, even arranging for the Germans to send a pension to the fictional widow. Another supposedly had an affair that Garbo had to manage. These weren't just names on a list. They were characters with personalities, problems, and motivations. The Germans trusted Garbo so completely they awarded him the Iron Cross, Nazi Medal for a double agent. Yes, the Nazis gave one of their highest honors to a man actively destroying them. But here's what makes this truly brutal. On June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, with Allied forces clinging to their beachheads, Garbo sends his masterpiece. A 3,000-word message so long it takes 2 hours to transmit, explaining that Normandy is the diversion. The 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, remains in Kent, waiting. 11 divisions, 150,000 men, commanded by George Patton himself. The real invasion of Calais is imminent. Hitler himself fell for it completely. For 7 weeks after D-Day, he kept the 15th Army at Calais, waiting for Patton's phantom divisions. When German generals requested permission to move south, Hitler refused. The real invasion was still coming. Garbo said so. Think about the bolds this took. The Allies weren't just lying about having extra forces, they were continuing the lie after their actual invasion had started, betting everything that the Germans would believe Normandy, where actual armies were actually dying, was fake, while the fake army was real. The scale of this con game defies belief. Inflatable armor. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, had 1,100 artists, designers, and sound engineers whose weapons were speakers, paint, and imagination. They'd set up dummy airfields with plywood planes, fake fuel deposits with empty boxes, harbors full of canvas landing craft that looked perfect from 30,000 feet, which is all that mattered since Allied air superiority meant German reconnaissance planes lasted about 30 seconds at low altitude. You're in the Dover Castle tunnels, carved into the white cliffs where the walls smell of chalk and damp. Dozens of radio operators sit at tables, telegraph keys clattering in a chaotic symphony. They're transmitting the fake radio traffic of entire divisions, supply requests, personnel transfers, complaints about the weather. Each operator has studied the fist, the distinctive rhythm of real radio operators from units that are actually in Scotland. The Germans, listening from across the Channel, hear an army preparing to invade. But the physical deception was just window dressing. The real magic: total intelligence domination. By 1944, British MI5 had achieved something unprecedented in espionage history. They controlled every single German agent in Britain. Not most, not nearly all. Every single one. The double-cross system, run by the 20 Committee. 20 as in Roman numerals XX, as in double-cross. These people loved their wordplay, had turned the entire German intelligence network into a puppet show. The Allies faced an impossible problem. They needed to invade France, but the Germans knew they were coming. The Wehrmacht had 58 divisions waiting in France in the Low Countries. The obvious landing site was Pas-de-Calais, 21 miles across the Channel, major ports, straight shot to Berlin. The Germans had positioned their strongest force there, the 15th Army, nearly 200,000 men, with panzer support. So the Allies decided to land at Normandy instead, where the defenses were weaker. But if those Calais divisions realized Normandy was the real invasion and rushed south, they'd throw the Allies back into the sea. The solution was breathtaking in its audacity. Convince the Germans that the massive Normandy invasion, 156,000 men, 7,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, was just a diversion. By the time the Germans realized the truth, the Allies had landed 2 million men in France. The breakout had begun. The war in Western Europe was effectively over. But here's the darkest joke of all. Operation Fortitude was so successful that after the war, the Allies had to create a cover story for why Fusag never invaded. They couldn't just tell the Germans it was all fake. They needed their double agents for the Cold War. Now let's see which deception actually deserves the crown.
The cases have been made. The evidence is in. It's time for the final showdown. On scale and complexity weighted at 20%, the Trojan Horse scores 4 out of 10. One wooden structure, maybe 50 men inside if we believe the most common number, which we shouldn't since sources range from 23 to 3,000. Operation Fortitude scores 9 out of 10. 6 months of sustained deception, thousands of personnel, 11 imaginary divisions complete with fake radio chatter and wedding announcements for soldiers who never existed. On psychological manipulation, weighted at 25%, the Trojan Horse scores 8 out of 10. The religious angle was genius, exploiting piety and war exhaustion. Operation Fortitude scores 9 out of 10. They didn't just exploit German beliefs, they became the enemy's entire intelligence picture. For 7 weeks after D-Day, Hitler still believed the real attack was coming at Calais. On innovation and audacity, weighted at 20%, the Trojan Horse scores 9 out of 10. If it was real, hiding soldiers inside a fake religious offering was a complete paradigm shift. Operation Fortitude scores 7 out of 10. Brilliant execution of existing concepts, but the pieces already existed. On strategic impact, weighted at 25%, the Trojan Horse scores 8 out of 10. Supposedly ended a 10-year war in one night. Operation Fortitude scores 10 out of 10. Kept 19 German divisions sitting uselessly at Calais while the Allies secured Normandy. Without it, D-Day might have failed.
On truth versus legend, weighted at 10%, the Trojan Horse scores 1 out of 10. It's almost certainly fiction, 0 archaeological evidence. Operation Fortitude scores 10 out of 10. Exhaustively documented with files, testimonies, and inflatable tanks you can see in museums. The totals: Trojan Horse lands at 6.7. Operation Fortitude scores 8.95. By the declared criteria, Fortitude takes it decisively. No tiebreaker needed.
The verdict is in. Operation Fortitude is the greater deception. It's not even close. But before you ancient history lovers start composing angry comments in Latin, let me explain why this verdict matters. The Trojan Horse scored 6.7 out of 10. Respectable for something that probably never happened. It's elegant, psychologically brilliant, allegedly decisive. But Operation Fortitude at 8.95 is what happens when deception becomes a science. It's the difference between a magic trick and industrial-scale reality manipulation. We didn't need the body count efficiency tiebreaker. The scoreboard alone crowned our winner. The Trojan Horse is a perfect story about a perfect trick. Too perfect. The kind of perfect that only exists when Roman poets are doing propaganda 1,200 years after the fact. Operation Fortitude is a messy, bureaucratic, terrifyingly effective operation that required thousands of people to maintain a lie so convincing that the enemy gave medals to the people destroying them. But here's the real deception we need to talk about, the one nobody mentions. The Trojan Horse itself might be history's most successful deception, just not the way you think. It convinced the entire world that a piece of Roman nationalist literature was Greek history. Virgil wrote the Aeneid to give Rome a noble origin story, to explain why the ancestors of Romans, the Trojans, lost to the Greeks only through divine intervention and treachery. And we bought it. For 2,000 years, we've been retelling Roman propaganda as if it were fact. Think about that. A Roman poet's fan fiction became more real in our collective memory than an actual military operation that saved hundreds of thousands of lives. We can visit the National World War II Museum and see the inflatable tanks. We can read Garbo's messages to his Nazi handlers. We can track how German divisions stayed frozen at Calais while the Allies secured Normandy. But ask anyone about military deception, and they'll mention the Trojan Horse first. You know why? Because we prefer our deceptions simple, dramatic, and decisive. The Trojan Horse is a story with a beginning, middle, and end. Bad guys trick good guys? Or is it good guys trick bad guys? Depends on your perspective. Either way, the war ends, credits roll. Operation Fortitude is complicated. It's committees and bureaucracy and weather reports and fake wedding announcements. It's a Spanish chicken farmer spending 2 hours transmitting a message about units that don't exist. It's Hitler staring at a map, convinced he's a genius while his empire collapses. It's messy and human and absolutely real. The Trojan Horse teaches us that enemies bearing gifts are dangerous. Operation Fortitude teaches us that with enough coordination, you can make your enemy see whatever you want them to see. One is a warning, the other is an instruction manual. But perhaps the greatest deception is this. We've spent 3,000 years debating whether the Trojan Horse was real, when the actual question should be why we so desperately want it to be. Maybe because a wooden horse full of warriors is easier to understand than a world where reality itself becomes a weapon.
Maybe because beware of Greeks bearing gifts is simpler advice than beware of your entire intelligence apparatus being compromised by someone with a tourist guidebook and a grudge. The Allies didn't need a wooden horse. They had something far more powerful: the enemy's complete inability to distinguish truth from fiction. And unlike the Trojans, the Germans never even got the poetic satisfaction of knowing exactly how they'd been fooled. Some went to their graves believing Fusag was real, that somewhere out there Patton's phantom army was still waiting. Reality beats fiction when fiction never actually happened. The verdict is in, but history is never that simple. Who gets your vote? Cast your judgment in the comments below. Speaking of spectacular deceptions that ended badly, tap the video on screen, Boleyn versus Antoinette. Our last episode where we asked which royal execution was more shocking, Anne Boleyn, who bought a French swordsman, or Mary Antoinette, who got a revolution. Turns out when you lose your head, the method matters less than the mob outside. Subscribe for the next trial. Stalin's Marxism-Leninism versus Hitler's Nazi socialism. Whose ideas killed more people? Warning, the body count is going to get dark. Thanks for watching Historical Verses.